Everyone laughed at the man who hauled old tires into his yard, but when they saw what he did with them, they were stunned. Subscribe and be sure to share this with your friends. The neighborhood had its own rhythm, a tired pulse that beat slowly beneath the weight of years spent struggling, surviving, and trying to pretend everything was fine. Houses stood in rows like aging soldiers, their peeling paint and cracked foundations telling stories of neglect and financial strain. The streets were filled with potholes that no one bothered to fix anymore, and sagging power lines stretched overhead like worn threads barely holding the place together. On muggy summer days, the heat trapped the smell of exhaust, stale beer, and fried food in the air. At night, an uneasy quietness took over, broken only by the distant wail of a siren or a short burst of laughter from a porch gathering. Some of the neighbors still tried to keep their small corners of the world decent, sweeping their sidewalks, fixing broken screens, and planting wilted flowers that clung to life despite the odds. Others had given up long ago. Among these houses, on a small lot squeezed between two run-down apartment buildings, lived a man named Darrell Benton. His house wasn't impressive by any measure. A single-story square structure with a sagging roof, a front porch patched with mismatched boards, and a narrow yard that looked larger from afar than it truly was. But, unlike many of the surrounding homes, Darrell's place always carried the faint impression of someone trying. The porch was freshly painted, even if the tone of gray seemed chosen more for practicality than style. The grass, though patchy, was cut regularly enough to leave visible lines. He repaired without complaint, replaced without boasting, and kept to himself without pushing anyone away. Darrell was a man who carried silence with him like a well-worn jacket. At the auto shop, where he worked as a mechanic, he spoke only when necessary. Short answers, quiet acknowledgments, a nod here, a shrug there. His co-workers respected him not for his friendliness, but for his reliability. If they needed something fixed right, he was the one they trusted. He arrived early, left late, and rarely shared anything about his personal life. It wasn't that he disliked company. He simply seemed more familiar with solitude than conversation. It was during one of those ordinary mornings when something changed in the familiar view outside his home. As he drove up in his old pickup truck, neighbors watched from their porches and windows as he unloaded a stack of worn-out tires. 4, maybe 5 of them. He carried them one by one to the side of his yard, aligned them neatly against the fence, brushed off his hands, and disappeared inside without offering any explanation. The sight sparked a flicker of curiosity, but nothing more. People shrugged it off. He was a mechanic after all. Maybe he was storing them temporarily for the shop. Maybe someone gave them to him for free, and he planned to recycle them. Tires weren't that unusual in his line of work. However, curiosity shifted to suspicion as the days passed. The number of tires increased steadily. 5 became 10, 10 became 20. The neat little pile grew into a wall of rubber rings towering above the fence line. The once open yard now looked like a construction area, cluttered with dark circles stacked meticulously with surprising precision. It wasn't a mess thrown together. It was intentional, structured. But structured toward what? That quickly became the question on everyone's lips. From behind slightly parted curtains, eyes followed Darrell's every movement. Some neighbors whispered amongst themselves while taking out their trash or collecting their mail. Others watched openly with narrowed eyes, their arms crossed defensively over their chests. A few children wandered close, eager to see the strange transformation happening next door, but their parents quickly called them back with firm voices and wary glances. They couldn't make sense of it. People liked what they understood, and this was decidedly not it. Darrell offered no explanation. He worked with a quiet determination, as though the world outside his fence didn't exist. After clocking out from the shop, he returned home and spent hours inspecting the tires, turning them, sorting them, and organizing them into new rows and shapes. His manner was methodical, almost meditative, as if each piece fit into a greater picture only he could see. Sometimes he paused, resting a hand on a tire and staring into space with an expression that was neither happy nor sad, just deeply focused, as though he were revisiting somewhere far away in his mind. The murmurs around the neighborhood grew louder. People tend to fear what they cannot define, especially when it rises up right before their eyes. The tire wall began to dominate the view, blocking sunlight and lines of sight, casting shadows into backyards where children once played. And though no one had yet confronted him directly, irritation simmered beneath the surface like coals waiting to ignite. One late afternoon, as Darrell was placing another tire onto an already impressive stack, a man walking his dog slowed to a stop near the yard. He didn't say a word, but the fierce disapproval etched into his face spoke volumes. He shook his head, muttered something under his breath, and tugged his dog forward with a tight jerk of the leash. Darrell saw him. Their eyes briefly met. The silence between them was dense, uncomfortable, and full of judgment. Darrell's gaze fell back to his work without response, but a faint tightening appeared around his mouth. He felt the tension, even if he refused to show it. That night, when the sun dipped behind the cracked rooftops, Darrell stood in the center of his transformed yard. The stacks around him were high enough now to form a partial enclosure. His home, once exposed to every passerby, was becoming a hidden island in a sea of black rubber. He turned slowly in place, studying the layout he'd created. The breeze brushed past him, carrying the muffled sound of televisions and clinking dinner plates from nearby houses. Yet, within this odd fortress, he felt strangely alone. Alone, and, at the same time, closer to something he had long held inside. For a moment, he closed his eyes, letting the present dissolve into memory. The smell of rubber always brought him back to a different time, a different version of himself. A barefoot boy climbing through junkyards, imagining worlds far beyond the chain-link fences. His hands were smaller then, his imagination bigger, and tires were the only toys he had ever truly owned. In those scraps of stolen childhood, he'd found a spark of happiness powerful enough to keep him alive through all the years that followed. Now, as a grown man, he was building something that only he could see clearly, at least for now. When he opened his eyes again, the yard was still the same, but the weight in his chest felt lighter. He stepped back toward his porch, unaware, or perhaps pretending to be unaware, of the dozens of suspicious eyes still watching. The neighborhood lights flickered on one by one, the world around him slipping into darkness, but in his mind, he had already begun shaping a brighter place from the shadows. That night marked a turning point. Not that anyone realized it yet. The first sparks of hostility were beginning to kindle, and the walls of tires stood like a challenge in the middle of the community. People continued to stare, whisper, and wonder what kind of madness was growing behind those black rings. But Darrell knew something none of them did. The tires were not a burden. They were not garbage. They were not a threat. They were a foundation. A promise he made long ago, now slowly rising from the ground. Even as exhaustion weighed on his shoulders and doubt crept into the corners of his mind, he refused to stop. Because what he was building wasn't meant to impress the neighborhood or silence their judgment. It was meant for someone else entirely, someone he wished had existed for him back when he was that lonely child scrambling through broken places in search of a safe space to simply be a kid. And though nobody else could see it yet, one day they would. For now, the only visible truth was this: the strange trash in the yard was growing, and so were the questions. The tires loomed higher and the tension thickened, but in the quiet determination of one man, something hopeful was beginning to take shape, quietly, stubbornly, and beautifully hidden within the fortress of rubber walls. The days that followed only deepened the transformation of Daryl's yard, and, with it, the growing unease that rippled through the neighborhood. What had once been a bare patch of grass and dirt behind his small house was now evolving into something larger, stranger, and harder to ignore. The stacked tires, orderly yet overwhelming, loomed over the wooden fence like a dark wave frozen in motion. They seemed to multiply overnight. Every morning, the neighbors would look out their windows and swear that at least a dozen new ones had appeared since the previous evening. It no longer felt like a harmless hobby or a temporary eyesore. It was becoming a structure in its own right. The tire towers cast long shadows across the adjoining yards. They cut sunlight from vegetable gardens and patios. Children, who used to run freely from one lot to another, now stopped in their tracks, staring wide-eyed at the growing barricade of rubber. Parents pulled them away with warnings that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Their anxious glances and clutched hands said enough. The smell of old rubber lingered faintly in the air some days, especially when the weather turned warm, and neighbors wrinkled their noses as though decay itself had crept into their community. People began to gather in small clusters outside their homes, united by confusion and irritation. Conversations always circled back to the same subject. What on earth was that man doing? Theories spread like roots beneath the streets. Some were careless jokes spoken loudly enough in hopes that Daryl might overhear. Others carried darker tones, suspicions of illegal dumping, hoarding, or disease. The most dramatic voices insisted that the piles attracted pests and should be removed immediately before something awful happened. No one cared to ask Daryl directly. It was easier to talk about him than to talk to him. From their perspective, he had brought this upon himself by choosing silence over explanation. If he refused to engage, then they would fill that silence with their own fears and assumptions. One woman, Mrs. Avery from 2 houses down, declared repeatedly that the tires were a fire hazard and sooner or later would burst into flames in the middle of a hot night. Another neighbor insisted he saw rats scurrying between the stacks, though no one else could confirm it. A group of teenagers joked that Daryl was building a fortress to hide delinquent activities inside. One boy suggested that maybe he lived among the tires now, burrowed like a creature into the rubber maze. Everyone laughed, but the laughter held a nervous edge. Some tried to approach the situation with a sense of superiority rather than fear. They stood in their freshly mowed yards and criticized the visual blight next door, speaking with an air of authority as though they were protectors of the neighborhood's dignity. They pointed out how their property values would drop, how no one wanted to live near that mess. Their words dripped with resentment, hidden behind the guise of community concern. As the noise outside his fence grew louder, Daryl continued his work with unwavering focus. He sorted the tires by size, by wear, by flexibility. Passenger car tires went one way, tractor tires another, and the rare oversized ones that once belonged to heavy machinery stood apart like sentinels waiting for their place in a future he had not yet revealed. He moved with quiet precision, sweat darkening his shirt as he worked long into the evenings under dim lights that cast eerie silhouettes on the fence. From outside, neighbors saw only an obsession taking shape, an inexplicable fixation on someone else's trash. Each night, after Darrell disappeared indoors, a few daring individuals ventured closer, drawn by morbid curiosity. They inspected the towering walls of rubber, whispering to one another as though they stood before a forbidden structure. Children peeked through narrow gaps between tires, imagining hidden rooms where ghostly figures might lurk. And if a stack of tires creaked or shifted unexpectedly in the wind, the onlookers would scatter with shrieks of fear, only to return the next night with heightened suspicion. Their curiosity soon mutated into frustration. Why should they tolerate this? Why should one man be allowed to reshape their environment without permission or explanation? It started with muttered complaints exchanged over fences, then advanced to direct remarks delivered too loudly to be casual. At first, Darrell pretended not to hear. He was used to silence, his own and that imposed by others. But when insult after insult drifted across the wooden boards of his fence, something inside him twisted painfully. There were knocks on his door he chose not to answer. He would hear hostile voices demanding that he stop or calling him names he had hoped never to hear again. Neighbors slammed their trash bin lids aggressively when he stepped outside. His presence became a trigger, a reminder of something they believed was ruining their neighborhood. Yet, no matter how harsh the words grew, he offered no reaction. He kept working, shoulders squared and mind locked on his vision. Still, the strain built day by day. Beneath the calm surface, Darrell could feel frustration coiling like a spring inside him. The man who had always been invisible was now the unwilling center of attention. They didn't see him. They saw only the tires. And that misunderstanding pressed against him harder than the tires stacked 24 high around his home. One evening, as he adjusted the alignment of a particularly large tire, a crumpled piece of paper tumbled from the fence and landed near his feet. He stared at it for a long moment before bending down. Unfolding it, he found words boldly scrawled in red marker. The message was crude, the handwriting jagged and full of anger. "Clean up your garbage or get out." Below it, another line was added almost as an afterthought. "You're making us look bad." For the first time since he began collecting the tires, Darrell felt something rise up in him that threatened to overpower the calm discipline he had held firmly until now. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, refusing to let the noise of the outside world drown out his purpose. He folded the note neatly, slipped it into his pocket as though it were something fragile, and returned to work without a sound. But his heart pounded faster now. The note was a reminder that the thin barrier separating tolerance from hostility was wearing away. Night after night, he worked beneath the weak glow of his porch light, guided by a vision that gave meaning to every motion. Yet, he was not unaware of the eyes that followed him from the shadows. He felt them. Their judgment sat heavy on his shoulders. With each tire he lifted, he battled not only its unexpected weight but also in the suffocating pressure of disapproval pressing from all sides. But he also battled memories, faces from his youth, voices that once scoffed at him, environments where being different meant being unwanted, and where poverty marked a child as less deserving. If the world wanted to believe he was mad, then perhaps madness was a kinder company than the cold cruelty of strangers. The rows of tires grew closer together, reaching higher toward the sky, forming corridors and pathways visible only to him. Sometimes he would pause and place his palm against the rubber surface, sensing the potential trapped within, like energy waiting to be released. Inside his mind, the noise of the neighborhood faded into nothing but the faint echo of children's laughter. Laughter that didn't yet exist. Laughter that he desperately wanted to hear in this barren corner of the city. Despite the chaos gathering outside his gate, Darrell remained driven by a purpose solidified long before the first tire ever touched his yard. Every evening, when the last neighbor finally drew their blinds, he would stand in the center of his creation and envision it alive with color and movement and joy, a safe place, a place for children who had none. His hands, calloused and worn, ached from the work, yet the ache felt righteous. He was building for those who could not build for themselves. Still, the resentment around him thickened like smoke. The transformation of his yard was not merely a physical intrusion. It became symbolic, a challenge to the community's fragile illusion of control. The louder their discontent grew, the more determined Darrell became. He no longer cared if they misunderstood him. He had spent his entire life being misunderstood. This time, he would not shrink away. This time, he would not let others dictate what he was allowed to create. One night, just after he finished organizing another row of tires, he stopped and looked up at the dark sky. The stars were faint, nearly swallowed by the city lights. The air felt heavy, and the distant hum of traffic merged with the stillness surrounding him. He ran his hand across his forehead, wiping away sweat and grime, and realized that his yard no longer resembled a yard at all. It was a work site, a staging ground for something much greater than anyone imagined. The feeling of progress warmed him, but it also cast a shadow of forewarning. He knew that resentment, once planted, could grow as wildly and rapidly as the tires now filling his life. People didn't like change, especially change they couldn't understand, and in their discomfort they would try to make him stop. They would push against him harder. They would demand compliance. He exhaled slowly, letting the cool air fill his lungs. The stacks of tires surrounded him on all sides, their looming presence closer and more consuming than ever before. They had become barriers to the neighborhood, but for him they were stepping stones toward hope. The world outside saw only garbage. He saw potential. The world outside saw a problem. He saw a solution. The growing resentment did not deter him. If anything, it fueled his resolve. Let them complain. Let them mock. He had been called worse in his lifetime, and while the voices around him sharpened like knives, Darrell reminded himself of the laughter he wanted to bring into existence, the laughter that would one day echo from the very structures they now despised. As he stepped into his house that night, the neighborhood settled into uneasy quiet. People were certain something was wrong, certain that danger lurked behind those towering walls. They could sense that the situation was approaching a breaking point. Yet, none of them could have imagined just how important those tires would become, not only to Darrell, but to every child who still believed a brighter place might be possible, even here. The tension weighed on the air as heavily as the rubber stacks closing in around his home, and while resentment continued to swell like a storm cloud preparing to break, Darrell remained steady, because he knew that storms, no matter how fierce, eventually passed. But what he was building, if he could finish it, would endure. The resentment brewing around Darrell's yard settled over the neighborhood like a thick fog, clinging to every conversation, every sideways glance, and every hurried whisper exchanged behind closed doors. For the people who lived on that weary block, the tires had become more than an eyesore. They were a symbol of something they could not define, and in that undefined space their imaginations grew feral. Rumors stretched like vines, each twisting away from the truth. And yet, while their judgment rose louder by the day, Darrell sank deeper into the quiet world inside his mind, a world shaped long before any of these neighbors ever knew his name. The present pressed hard against him, but the past, his past, pressed harder. One evening, after a particularly tense day of muffled insults from the street and a few hostile knocks he chose to ignore, Darrell stepped into the middle of his yard. The air hung heavy with the scent of aged rubber and approaching rain. The stacks of tires around him formed a maze, their dark silhouettes rising like walls of a fortress. He paused there, breathing slowly, as though trying to regulate not only his breath but his thoughts, which had begun to stir in directions he hadn't visited for years. He sank down onto one of the larger tires, letting its familiar firmness support his weight. And as often happened when exhaustion met emotion, memory crept quietly through the cracks of his mind. The yard around him dissolved into a hazy silhouette, the sounds of the neighborhood slipping into distance, and he found himself standing once more on the dusty, uneven ground of the place he grew up, an old, forgotten street on the city's outskirts where broken homes leaned into one another and children learned early how to carry themselves like shadows. The boy he had been was wiry and fast, barefoot through half the year, with a sharp gaze trained by necessity on everything around him. The world had never made space for him. He'd carved out what little he had from scraps and silence. His mother worked 3 jobs that rarely paid enough. She was a gentle woman worn down by life, a figure whose tired smile flickered like a candle trying to survive a storm. Sometimes she came home with bruised wrists from cleaning motel rooms too quickly, or cuts on her palms from broken glass she wasn't given gloves to handle. She never complained. Complaints were luxuries reserved for people whose lives allowed for softness. The 2 of them lived in a cramped apartment where the walls were thin enough to hear every argument, every drunken fight, every heartbreak happening next door. There were no toys, no outings, no bedtime stories, only survival day by day. The outside world became Darrell's escape, and in that world, the place that called to him most was the junkyard behind the abandoned auto shop. It was a graveyard of forgotten machines, rusted metal, and the remnants of other people's lives tossed aside when they no longer served a purpose. But to Darrell, it was magic. He remembered the first time he found the tires, stacked lopsided near a fence, some cracked, others still sturdy enough to roll. He had touched them with the sense of reverence only a child could possess, tracing his fingers along their treads, feeling the grooves like secret messages carved into something ancient and important. They became his building blocks, his hiding places, his forts, his ships, his stepping stones into other worlds. He would spend hours climbing through them, stacking them, imagining elaborate kingdoms where he was the hero and not the invisible boy who slipped through the cracks of his own neighborhood. When other children joined him, they brought their own laughter, their own dreams, their own temporary freedom. For a handful of moments, they weren't poor. They weren't forgotten. They weren't the children of broken homes and empty refrigerators. They were just kids playing, something more powerful than they ever admitted to themselves. Those days had shaped him more than any lesson learned in school. He had discovered that joy didn't require money, that imagination could turn scraps into treasures, that safety wasn't always a place, it was a feeling he had found only there in the circle of tires. But childhood was never meant to last long for boys like him. Responsibility crept in early, demanding sacrifices. He remembered the night everything shifted, the night his mother didn't come home from work. He sat on the couch until dawn, staring at the peeling wallpaper and listening to the neighbors fight through the walls, a numbness spreading through his body. She returned late the next morning, exhausted and shaken, with a cut across her long sleeve. She tried to hide it, but he'd seen enough to understand that the world wouldn't protect either of them. From then on, he spent less time at the junkyard. The magic faded as survival took over. The memories came and went like slow-moving waves as he sat on the tire in his yard. He could feel the ache of the boy he once was. That boy had needed a safe place, needed joy, needed space to imagine a world better than the one he was given. But he never had it. Not really. Those tires in the junkyard were all he had. And now, as an adult, he was building something far more beautiful than what he had been given. He wanted children in this neighborhood to have a place that wasn't abandoned or unsafe. A place that wasn't thrown together in haste or made from scraps of neglect. He wanted to create something sturdy, colorful, warm, something that told every child who stepped into it, "You matter. You are safe here. This place is yours." He rubbed his palms together in the present moment, grounding himself again. The sounds of the neighborhood drifted back into clarity. A dog barking, a television murmuring through an open window, the distant slam of a car door. But now those noises felt muted, insignificant compared to the weight of his past and the determination anchored in his chest. For the first time since he began collecting the tires, he felt the old pain transform into something constructive, something almost bright. It wasn't nostalgia he felt. It was purpose. The next morning, he returned to work with renewed focus, but the neighborhood only seemed to grow more hostile. As he lifted the tires into place, he could hear snippets of conversations from behind fences and patios. They were louder now, more confident in their disdain. Someone called him a hoarder. Another said he was mentally unstable. The words stung, but he swallowed them like he always had, burying the hurt beneath layers of resolve. He had spent his whole life being judged, by teachers, by employers, by strangers who thought they understood him because they understood someone else like him once. But none of them had ever known his heart. None of them had ever seen what he carried inside. Even as the present pushed against him with growing hostility, he remained anchored by the boy he used to be, and the promise he had made long ago, silently and earnestly, to himself. He had promised that one day he would create a place for kids who had nothing. A place where they could breathe easier. A place that gave them hope. That promise had followed him through every job, every hardship, every lonely night in his small house. It lived quietly inside him until the moment he decided to build this sanctuary from the very material that once gave him freedom. And now, with every tire he lifted, every structure he planned, that promise took shape. As the days blended together, he found himself working faster, as if racing against an invisible deadline. He knew that resentment would soon turn into action. Angry neighbors didn't stay angry in silence for long. His past had taught him that loud voices eventually found ways to make their anger tangible. But he also knew that he had to continue. He owed it to the child he had been. He owed it to the children who still wandered these streets with nothing but cracked sidewalks and empty lots as their playgrounds. By the time the sun set that evening, he had created a new row of tires arranged in a gentle curve, like the beginning of an archway. The sight of it stirred something tender in him. It looked almost like an entrance into the world he wished to build. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine brightly painted walls, tunnels carved from repurposed rubber, swings that creaked with laughter, slides assembled from smooth surfaces. He envisioned children running freely without fear of broken glass or dangerous strangers or the numbness of neglect. He imagined a place where their imagination could run wild, just as his once had. When he finally stepped inside his house that night, the memory of the junkyard still lingered in his mind, intertwined with the humiliation of the neighborhood's hostility and the stubborn persistence of his dream. The shadows of his past didn't frighten him. They guided him. They reminded him that from the darkest corners beauty could grow, that even rubber scraps could become castles, that even forgotten spaces could become sanctuaries. The past had shaped him. The neighborhood was testing him, but what he was building, what he envisioned, was greater than both, and as long as that vision remained alive inside him, he would continue, piece by piece, tire by tire, until the world outside his fence saw not madness, but meaning. The memories of his childhood, of that dusty junkyard, of the fragile moments of joy he had carved from the scraps around him, lingered in Darrell's mind long after he rose from the tire and went back inside his dimly lit home. They stayed with him as he washed the grease from his hands, as he set out his clothes for the next workday, and even as he drifted into an uneasy sleep filled with echoes of laughter, both real and remembered. But morning always brought him back to the hard light of the present, where the neighborhood's hostility waited like a storm cloud suspended just above his head, thickening with each passing day. By the time dawn broke, the tension around his property was palpable. The neighbors no longer tried to hide their resentment behind closed blinds or quiet mutters. Now they watched openly, arms crossed over their chests, their expressions pinched and unforgiving, as though the sight of him hauling yet another tire was a personal offense. Their frustration had matured into something sharper, something colder. Every time he stepped outside, he could feel their eyes prickling against his skin like static. The transformation of his yard had reached a point where it was impossible to ignore. The mounds of tires towered higher than the fence, forming a labyrinth of black circles stacked with peculiar precision. What had once been a backyard now resembled a strange industrial ruin, dark and imposing. For Darrell, every row had purpose. Every placement was a step toward a dream he had carried for decades. But to the residents of Maplebridge Street, it looked like chaos. They saw decay, not possibility, madness, not intention. One afternoon, as he hauled a pair of tires from his truck, a voice sliced through the humid air like a blade. "Are you ever going to stop?" He turned automatically, though the sharpness of the tone already told him everything he needed to know. A man stood at the edge of the sidewalk, hands on his hips, posture wide and confrontational. It was Leonard, a middle-aged neighbor who lived directly across the street, and who had spent weeks complaining loudly to anyone who would listen that Darrell was ruining the block. Darrell met his gaze for a fleeting moment, then lowered his eyes and returned to his work without a word. The man scoffed loudly enough to make sure he was heard. "Of course you ignore me. Figures." A few other neighbors had gathered nearby, drawn out by the rising tension. They murmured among themselves, exchanging remarks that were too quiet to decipher, but unmistakably hostile in tone. Darrell kept working, letting their words fall away like rain against stone. But inside his chest, the pressure gathered. It didn't end there. Later that evening, as he was adjusting a row of tires along the fence, he heard footsteps approach. Two women stood beside the fence, one tapping impatiently against the wood with her manicured fingernail. Their expressions were full of indignation. "Do you have any idea what this looks like?" one demanded. Darrell didn't answer. Not because he couldn't, but because he knew that no explanation he offered would satisfy them. They weren't seeking understanding. They were seeking compliance. "This is disgusting," she snapped. "You're bringing down everyone's property value. You need to get rid of this mess." The second woman nodded vigorously. "Our kids can't even play outside anymore. This is an eyesore. You're poisoning the entire neighborhood with whatever this is." Darrell inhaled slowly but didn't turn toward them. He secured the tire on its mount and walked away. His silence only enraged them further. One of the women slapped the fence hard. "Fine, ignore us, but don't think you can ignore the whole neighborhood forever." He heard their footsteps retreat, and the fence fell silent once more. But their voices clung to him like burrs stuck to his clothes, sharp and stubborn. He knew more confrontations would follow. He knew people were gathering like a pack, circling prey, emboldened by each other's anger. Within a week, the hostility reached a new level. Someone threw an empty soda can over the fence. Another day, a crumpled fast food bag landed in his yard, its contents smeared across the dirt. A tire in one of his carefully arranged stacks was knocked askew, though he couldn't tell if it had been deliberate sabotage or just the wind. But the pattern was unmistakable. People were no longer content with words. Their frustration had begun to manifest physically. One night, long after midnight, Darrell stepped onto his porch for some air. The neighborhood was quiet, but not peacefully so. It was the tense kind of quiet that feels like a held breath. The street lamps flickered faintly, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. In the stillness, Darrell imagined he heard something. Footsteps near the back fence, a rustle between the humps of tires. He stiffened, listening. For a moment, all he heard was the beating of his own heart. Then, slowly, the noise vanished. Whether it had been real or the result of nerves wound too tight, he couldn't tell, but sleep did not come easily after that. The next morning confirmed his fears. A section of the wall of tires he'd spent hours building had been toppled, intentionally. There was no natural explanation for the collapse. The way the tires lay scattered made it clear someone had pushed them, perhaps late in the night, perhaps expecting the entire structure to fall. Fortunately, only part of it had given way. Still, it hurt. Not just physically when he lifted them back into place, but emotionally. It felt like someone had laid a hand on a dream he'd kept locked away from the world his entire life. He didn't report it. He didn't march across the street to point fingers. That wasn't who he was. Instead, he rebuilt quietly, as though repairing not just his structure, but the fragile barrier that shielded his heart. Yet, the struggle outside was not his only battle. Inside him, a private war was unfolding. Every insult, every hostile glance, every act of vandalism pulled at the old wounds he thought he had buried in childhood. He remembered being mocked at school for wearing hand-me-down clothes, for not having a lunch some days, for living in a home too small and too broken. He remembered standing defenseless as other kids made jokes about his mother, about his skin, about his poverty. And he remembered the silence. His silence. Because speaking only ever made things worse. That silence clung to him even now. But with it came something else. A fire so small and steady that it refused to be extinguished. It was the same fire that kept him alive as a boy, pushing him to survive each new hardship. And now, it was the fire that fueled his determination to finish what he had started, no matter what the neighborhood threw at him. Still, the threats grew bolder. One afternoon, while Darrell worked near the far corner of his yard, a group of teenagers approached the fence. They leaned against it, the wood creaking under their weight, and watched him with smirks plastered across their faces. He didn't look at them directly, but he could feel their eyes on him. They whispered mockingly, laughed at jokes made at his expense, and kicked the fence hard enough to make the tires tremble. He froze for a moment, gripping the tire in his hands tightly before continuing his work. "That thing gonna fall on you?" one boy taunted. "Better hope it does," another said with a snort. "Then maybe we won't have to look at this trash anymore." Their laughter erupted again, sharp and cutting. When they finally wandered off, Darrell let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His hands trembled slightly, a faint mix of anger and something more fragile. Something like hurt. But it wasn't only the neighbors and teenagers who opposed him. The environment itself seemed determined to wear him down. The heat grew more oppressive. The tires absorbed the sun, radiating warmth like massive stones. His shirts were drenched daily in sweat. His hands became raw from constant lifting and pulling. Bruises appeared on his arms like dark fingerprints. His body screamed for rest, yet he kept moving, driven by the relentless urge to finish before the world shut him down. In quieter moments, he wondered if he was being selfish. If continuing this alone, against the entire block, was an act of pride rather than purpose. But then he remembered the children, those small faces he passed on the sidewalk, those kids who had nothing but broken alleys and dangerous corners to play in. He remembered the boys who, just the other week, kicked bottle caps around, pretending they were hockey pucks because they had nothing else. He remembered the little girl across the way who drew with chalk on the cracked concrete because it was the only safe activity available to her. These children deserved better. He would not stop until they had it. Weeks passed. The resentment escalated into something more organized. Neighbors held informal gatherings where they discussed what to do about him. They drew up complaints and passed them around for signatures. One evening, while he watered the strip of garden he'd always tended before the tires encroached on the space, he overheard a group of people near the end of the block discussing calling city officials on him. Their voices were low, conspiratorial. They spoke of zoning violations, of fire hazards, of sanitation concerns. They didn't know the details. Details didn't matter. All that mattered was giving their anger a legal pathway. Darrell felt the weight of inevitability settle onto him like a heavy cloak. He knew the authorities would come. He knew scrutiny was coming, and he knew he wasn't ready yet. Not yet. The playground he envisioned was still trapped in the rough beginnings of its construction, and the neighborhood saw only the worst parts of the process. As he prepared for the confrontation he sensed approaching, a familiar ache tugged at his chest. He looked around his yard, at the stacks he had built, with hands that trembled now more than they ever had in his youth. The maze of tires felt like a physical manifestation of his heart. Messy on the outside, misunderstood, but full of meaning only he could see. He stood there for a long time, breathing in the scent of rubber and earth, listening to the distant sounds of people living their lives on the other side of the fence, people who would never understand what he was trying to build. But as the hours passed, the tension in his muscles eased. Resolve settled into his bones once more. The past was a weight, yes, but also a foundation. The neighborhood was an obstacle, but also a reminder of why this mattered. And the enemies gathering on both sides of the fence, external and internal, only strengthened his determination. He would not stop. He could not stop, not because he was stubborn, but because the dream he carried was bigger than the fear surrounding it. The shadows of his past had shaped him, but they would not define him. And as long as he had breath left in his body, the playground he envisioned would rise, even if the entire neighborhood tried to tear it down, tire by tire. The neighborhood's hostility had grown so thick that it clung to the very air, making every step Darrell took across his yard feel heavier than the last. The insults, the threats, the destruction of his work, each had carved small wounds inside him, wounds that stung but did not bleed enough to make him stop. Yet, beneath his determination lived an uneasiness he could not shake. The tension on Maplebridge Street had reached a breaking point, and even before the first city vehicle arrived, he sensed the shift in the atmosphere. Something was coming. Something official. Something he could not silence simply by ignoring it. It happened on a cool morning when the sun had barely cleared the rooftops and the air still carried the dampness of dawn. Darrell stepped outside with a stack of worn gloves tucked under his arm, intending to begin the day's work before the heat took hold. But the sight waiting for him at the curb froze him in place. A white city truck sat idling in front of his house, letters stenciled in blue across the side panel. Two inspectors stepped out, clipboards in hand, their bright vests cutting sharply through the muted tones of the street. The sound of car doors slamming seemed to echo across the entire block. Curtains twitched, blinds shifted, doors creaked. Neighbors emerged with an eagerness only conflict could inspire. Some lingered near their fences. Others pretended to check their mail or sweep their porches, all while keeping their eyes fixed firmly on the men in vests. The tension that had simmered for weeks now crystallized into a kind of spectacle, an event the entire street had been waiting for. For a long moment, Darrell remained still, standing in the narrow pathway between two towering stacks of tires. He felt the weight of so many gazes pressing against his back. He straightened slowly, wiped his palms against his jeans, and stepped out of the maze he had built. As he approached the sidewalk, one of the inspectors looked up and met his eyes with a neutral expression. Not friendly, not hostile, simply procedural. "Are you the property owner?" the man asked. Darrell nodded once. The inspector introduced himself, though Darrell barely registered the name. His heart pounded against his ribs as the man explained the nature of their visit. They had received multiple complaints from residents, concerns about sanitation, safety hazards, fire risks, odor, attracting pests. The list went on, delivered with the monotone efficiency of someone who had read the same phrases to countless others in neighborhoods just like this one. The second inspector, shorter and older, walked along the fence line, peering through the gaps to get a better look at the yard behind it. People gathered more openly now. A few crossed the street to stand closer, as though proximity might validate the importance of their grievances. The tension became something physical, something thick and heavy that hovered above the ground like humidity before a storm. It was no longer simply neighbors disliking a project they did not understand. It was the collective pressure of a community that had decided he was wrong. Darrell kept his face expressionless as the inspectors began their work. They walked the perimeter of the yard, taking notes, snapping photos with their phones. Every click of the camera pierced him like a needle. He watched silently as they documented his tire stacks from multiple angles. One inspector poked at a pile cautiously, stepping back when a tire shifted and wobbled. Another measured the distance between the stacks and the property line, muttering something to himself. Their movements were slow, deliberate, invasive. One of the neighbors, a woman who had been among the first to confront him weeks ago, approached the inspectors eagerly, her voice carrying clearly across the sidewalk. She spoke loudly about how unsafe the situation was, how the tires smelled, how they made her children sick to their stomachs. Another neighbor joined in, insisting that rats had taken refuge in the piles. A third added comments about the visual blight, gesturing dramatically toward the yard as though it were a crime scene. The inspectors listened politely, but not warmly, nodding as they documented each complaint. They walked into the backyard only after Darrell reluctantly unlocked the gate, though his shoulders tensed as they stepped inside. His yard, his sanctuary, his worksite, his unfinished dream, felt exposed in a way he could hardly bear. The inspectors moved between the stacks, stepping carefully, examining how the tires were arranged. They spoke in quiet voices to each other, murmuring technical terms and referencing municipal codes. Every word sounded like a threat. More neighbors arrived, forming little clusters in the street. Their whispers grew louder. Their eyes followed every movement of the inspectors as though this was a performance staged for their entertainment. Someone took out a phone and began filming. Another snapped photos, posting them to social media before the moment had even finished unfolding. It was no longer just a neighborhood issue. It was an event. Darrell felt his pulse quicken. The edges of his vision tightened. He wished he could retreat into the maze of tires where the world's voices could be muffled, where he could hear nothing but his own breath and the rustle of rubber shifting under his hands. But there was no retreat today. The inspectors walked back toward him at last, their expressions hard to decipher. "We're going to have to document this as a potential violation," one of them said carefully. "You may be required to remove these tires. The city ordinance doesn't permit storage of this amount without proper containment and clearance, and there are concerns about fire hazard and structural stability." Darrell swallowed. His throat had gone dry. The words landed like blows, expected yet still painful. The inspector continued, explaining the notice they intended to issue, the possible fines, the deadlines. They spoke of regulations and compliance, of necessary action and required changes. It all blurred into a fog of formality. Behind them, the neighbors watched with satisfaction, their faces bright with the vindication they felt they deserved. But then the inspector paused, as though sensing the gravity of his words. He lowered his clipboard slightly. "You have a right to appeal," he said, "but until then, you'll need to begin removing the tires. Let's try to resolve this with as little trouble as possible." The phrase struck him harder than anything else. Resolve this. As though his dream was the trouble. As though the thing he had poured weeks of sweat, pain, and memory into was nothing more than a nuisance to be erased. The inspectors handed him the paperwork, a printed notice with bold letters and legal phrasing that felt as cold as iron. He held it with numb fingers, staring at the lines that declared his work a problem, a hazard, a violation. His eyes skimmed over the deadlines. They weren't long, not nearly long enough. When the inspectors finally left, the crowd remained, buzzing like flies around fruit left too long in the sun. They murmured among themselves, exchanging proud looks as if they had accomplished something noble. Some turned to go back inside, but only after giving Darrell one last victorious glance. Others lingered, waiting to see if he would protest, if he would cause a scene. But he didn't. He stood silently on the sidewalk, the notice hanging loosely in his hand, the wind rustling the corner of the paper like a whisper of mockery. He knew they expected him to break, that the weight of the notice, combined with the neighborhood's pressure, would be enough to make him surrender. But surrender was a luxury he could not afford. Not now. Not after everything he had already endured. The dream he carried had been born from places far deeper and darker than neighborhood complaints. It had roots in the lonely recesses of his childhood, in the forgotten corners where children were left to fend for themselves. It had survived poverty, heartbreak, and abandonment. A violation notice would not be the thing to kill it. Still, fear gnawed at him. The fear of running out of time. The fear of failing the children who needed this place. The fear of watching his dream crumble not by his own hands but by the will of others. That fear fueled him, sharpening his determination into something fierce and urgent. That night, he did not sleep. He sat at the kitchen table under the dim flicker of the overhead light, the notice lying in front of him like a challenge. Outside, the street was quiet again, but a different kind of quiet. One filled with the echoes of the day's hostility. He reread the notice again and again, his eyes lingering on the deadline. Each hour was precious now. Each minute mattered. By dawn, when the first hints of light crept through his blinds, he rose with a resolve so firm it steadied his trembling hands. He stepped outside and surveyed his yard, the maze of tires still standing tall, still waiting, still unformed but full of promise. If the city wanted to take this from him, they would need to find him fighting for it until the very last moment. He began working faster than ever before. His movements became sharper, more precise, as though every second was borrowed from a clock ticking toward demolition. He cut wood for supports, reinforced stacks, organized tires into the beginnings of recognizable structures. He sanded edges, smoothed surfaces, and planned new designs on scraps of cardboard. He painted the first hints of color on a row of tires, turning black rubber into sunbursts of red and yellow and blue. Each stroke was a declaration that he would not yield. Every muscle in his body screamed under the strain. His hands bled, his back ached, sweat soaked through his clothes, and still he worked. Through day and twilight and into the deep hours of the night, he pushed himself beyond exhaustion. He could not afford to stop, not when the dream was so close to emerging from the chaos. Between frantic bursts of construction, he made phone calls to community centers, to old contacts, to the one place he thought might understand, the local children's shelter. He asked if they would be willing to bring the children to see the playground when it was done. Not for attention, but for hope. He knew that when the neighborhood saw children laughing, touching, climbing, running, that would speak louder than anything he could ever say. He hung up the phone with a fragile sense of hope beating inside him. If everything went as planned, if he could finish in time, something extraordinary might happen, something that could silence the resentment and reshape the entire block. Night after night, he built with the urgency of a man who knew that failure was not an option. The playground began to take shape, not fully, not perfectly, but enough. Enough for imagination to fill in the missing pieces. Enough to show the beginnings of what he intended. A sanctuary drawn from the echoes of his childhood, a place where children could climb out of hardship the same way he had once climbed through the rings of old rubber. He was exhausted, but each day he stood a little taller even beneath the weight of the neighborhood's hostility. And though fear followed him like a shadow, hope, quiet, stubborn, unyielding, grew beside it. The deadline was approaching. The neighborhood was watching. The city was waiting. And somewhere across town, a group of children were preparing, unknowingly, to step into a place built for them long before they were born. A place born from scraps, from memory, from pain. A place Daryl would finish, even if it meant giving every last ounce of strength he had left. Because dreams, he knew, were worth building, even when the world tried to tear them down. The night before everything changed was one of the longest nights of Daryl's life. He worked until his muscles trembled, until his breath came in shallow gasps, until the porch light above him flickered twice, then burned steadily again, as if urging him forward. Every movement felt like it carried not just weight, but meaning. The stacks that had once seemed like nothing more than rubber towers of misunderstanding were now transforming into arches, tunnels, steps, platforms, and soft-edged shapes that hinted at something joyful. The playground wasn't finished, not the way he imagined it in its fullest form, but it was complete enough to show its soul. He painted until his hands shook, until color bled into his fingernails. Splashes of red, yellow, blue, and green brightened the once dark surfaces, turning discarded scraps into invitations for imagination. By the time dawn crept into the sky, he had barely slept an hour, but he was ready. The air that morning felt different. Not lighter, no, the tension in the neighborhood had only grown heavier, thicker, the kind of tension that warned of conflict even before the first voices were raised. But beneath that heaviness, something else stirred, something electric and uncertain, like the moment before a curtain lifts in a dimly lit theater. Daryl sensed it as soon as he stepped outside. Maplebridge Street was awake far earlier than usual. People stood on sidewalks, leaning on fences, hovering near mailboxes and front porches with thinly veiled anticipation. They pretended to busy themselves with morning tasks, sweeping already clean steps or watering plants that didn't need water, but their eyes kept drifting toward his yard. They had been waiting for this day. The day the inspectors returned to determine the fate of his creation. The day the neighborhood believed would restore normalcy, as though tearing down the maze of tires would erase the weeks of frustration they had allowed to fester in their hearts. The resentment they had carried so openly was now layered with a smug expectation. They believed they had won. Daryl ignored their stares and moved with steady, quiet purpose. He walked along the edge of his yard and checked each structure, ensuring nothing had shifted in the night. He tightened ropes, straightened a painted tire arch, and reinforced a wooden beam. He took a step back and observed the entrance of what was now undeniably a playground, colorful, whimsical, imperfect, but alive. The sight pulled at something deep inside him, something close to relief but still too fragile to name. Time crawled slowly, and yet somehow too fast, until a soft rumble of an engine broke the uneasy morning stillness. Around the corner appeared the white city vehicle that had become a symbol of dread in the neighborhood. As it slowed to a stop in front of his home, conversations across the street hushed instantly. The tension peaked, thick enough to feel in the air. Two inspectors stepped out once more. They carried clipboards, papers, and a practiced manner of neutrality. But this time there was something else in their demeanor. Something guarded, as though they anticipated the neighborhood's reaction as much as they anticipated the condition of Daryl's yard. The residents began gathering again, forming a scattered semicircle along the curb as though witnessing the final act of a play. Some crossed their arms with satisfaction. Others exchanged smirking glances. A few children peeked from behind their parents' legs, their expressions a mix of curiosity and confusion. One of the inspectors approached the gate. "We're here to complete our follow-up inspection," he said, though there was no need for the announcement. Everyone knew why they were here. Daryl stepped aside, unlocking the gate with slow deliberation. The metal latch squeaked softly, a small sound swallowed instantly by the neighborhood's collective silence. The inspectors entered the yard. They stopped. And for a moment, One brief, breathless moment, their neutral expressions flickered. What they saw was not the fortress of junk they had documented before. It was not a chaotic maze of rubber stacked without purpose. Instead, they found themselves standing at the edge of something unexpectedly bright, oddly beautiful, and undeniably intentional. The tire structures formed winding paths and gentle curves, painted in vibrant colors that softened their industrial origins. There was a climbing arch fashioned from interlocked tires, a rolling tunnel that led into a rounded nook, a small platform supported by carefully cut wood beams, and even the beginnings of a slide assembled from smoothed, polished panels. It was still rough in places, incomplete in others, but it was unmistakably a playground, a place built for children. The inspectors exchanged glances. One reached out and pressed a hand against the painted tire arch, testing its stability. It held firm. He walked along the curved pathway, noting the sanding and smoothing done to the edges, the careful placement of support beams, the thought put into every detail. The second inspector crouched to examine the structure's base, checking for hazards, assessing construction. The longer they inspected, the more their professional detachment wavered. Meanwhile, the murmurs among the neighbors grew louder. Some were confused. Others muttered in frustration. A few fell silent entirely, their eyes widening as they began to understand what they were looking at. But before the inspectors could deliver any kind of decision, the sound of another engine drifted down the street. Deeper, older, rattling slightly as it approached. Heads turned, confusion rippling through the crowd like a wave. A long yellow vehicle appeared at the end of the block, turning slowly onto Maplebridge Street. It was a school bus. No, not a school bus exactly, but a transport bus used by the local children's shelter. It rolled to a gentle stop just a few feet from the city truck. The doors opened with a soft hiss, and then, like sunlight breaking through clouds, children began to step out. Small faces, thin shoulders, worn shoes, eyes curious and cautious at first, scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. They grouped together in small clusters, whispering excitedly, looking toward the yard with growing interest. A social worker stepped down behind them, offering a polite nod to Darryl. He had invited them. They had come. The presence of the children shifted everything. The tension that had frozen the neighborhood began to crack. The children approached the gate in hesitant steps, their expressions brightening as they looked past the inspectors and caught sight of the colorful structures inside. It was instinctive. Their faces lit up, their bodies leaned forward, and joy moved in them like a spark catching a dry wick. They saw a playground. Not a nuisance, not an eyesore, not a hazard. A playground. One of the older children gasped. Another tugged at a friend's sleeve, pointing eagerly at the arch. A little boy with tangled curls stepped forward and pressed his hands against the gate, peering in with awe. The social worker looked at Darryl, silently asking permission. He nodded. The gate opened, and the children poured inside like a rush of warm, living energy. Their laughter filled the air immediately, bright, loud, and beautiful in a way that made Darryl's heart clench. They climbed the arches, crawled through the tunnels, sat on platforms, and explored every crevice of the playground he had built, testing it with the unrestrained curiosity only children possessed. Their excitement spilled over the fences into the entire neighborhood, a sound so pure and undeniable that it silenced every murmur, every complaint, every bitter voice. The inspectors froze in place, caught between their duty and the spectacle unfolding around them. They watched as a girl in a floral dress toddled toward a painted tire, running her fingers along the colorful stripes. They watched as two boys scrambled over a platform designed for climbing, laughing breathlessly. They watched as a group of younger children crawled through the large tunnel, their giggles echoing like music. The structure they had come to condemn was unmistakably bringing joy. They exchanged another look, this one softer, tinged with something human rather than procedural. One of them slowly closed his clipboard. The other sighed quietly, as though releasing the last bit of tension from his chest. Behind the inspectors, the neighbors remained frozen. Their earlier bravado drained from their expressions, replaced by a mix of shock and dawning shame. Their eyes flicked from the children to Darryl, then back to the playground. Some shifted uncomfortably, guilt settling across their faces in quiet, undeniable waves. Others simply stared, unable to reconcile the ugly assumptions they'd carried with the beauty unfolding before them. A few children from the neighborhood, even those whose parents had insisted they stay away from the yard weeks ago, wandered down the sidewalk, drawn by the sound of play. They approached cautiously, glancing back at their parents for permission they were not sure they would receive. But the playground was too inviting, too alive. Soon, these children too slipped inside the gate, joining the others in a swirl of color and motion. In that moment, the street changed. The inspectors stepped forward, their voices gentle now rather than stern. They spoke quietly to each other, reviewing the safety features, acknowledging the effort placed into reinforcing each structure. They pointed out areas needing improvement, but the tone had shifted entirely. This was no longer about tearing the playground down. It was about ensuring it could remain standing. Meanwhile, Darryl stood slightly apart, leaning against a wooden post, his shoulders lowered not from defeat, but from an overwhelming sense of release. He watched the children play, not just the shelter kids, but the neighborhood children too, mixing together effortlessly. Their laughter bounced from tire to tire, filling the yard with a sound he had waited his entire life to hear. He hadn't slept, he hadn't eaten. His hands were bruised, blistered, and shaking, but he felt whole. The social worker approached him quietly. "They love it," she said. "You've given them something they've never had." Darryl nodded wordlessly, unable to find his voice. On the other side of the fence, a few neighbors finally approached, not with anger, but with hesitation. One man cleared his throat awkwardly and lowered his gaze. Another woman, who had once yelled at him across the fence, now seemed unable to meet his eyes at all. Their faces held apology, uncertainty, and a dawning understanding of how wrong they had been. But Darryl didn't need their words. He didn't need their approval. The laughter inside the yard said everything that mattered. By midday, the inspectors delivered their decision. The playground could stay. There would be conditions, safety inspections, minor adjustments, some additional reinforcements, but it would not be destroyed. It would not be erased. It would grow. The neighborhood absorbed the news with stunned silence. The children did not. They continued playing, undeterred by the world of adults around them, and as the sun reached its highest point, casting warm light across the yard, Darryl stood in the center of it all, surrounded by joy he had never been given as a child, but had now managed to create for others. His dream had stepped out of the shadows and into the light. And the entire neighborhood, whether they wanted to or not, had witnessed its birth. The day of revelation had come. The hours that followed the inspector's decision unfolded like a slow sunrise over a long, cold night. It was not an abrupt transformation, not a single sweeping moment where everything snapped into place, but a gradual thawing. First in expressions, then in gestures, then in the hearts of the very people who had spent weeks sharpening their anger against Daryl's back. The laughter of the children lingered long after the bus drove away, trailing behind them like threads of sunlight that refused to dim. Even after they were gone, the echo of their joy clung to the air, settling into the spaces that had once held resentment. Daryl remained in the yard until the last child left, watching the colors he had painted come alive under the afternoon light. He had never imagined the playground could feel so full, so complete, even in its unfinished state. The bright paint caught the sun, casting reflections across the rubber surfaces like stained glass on stone. The sight reminded him of something he couldn't quite name, a memory that lived somewhere between the happiness he felt now and the longing he had carried since childhood. As the yard slowly emptied and quieted, he felt the weight of exhaustion settle into his body. But it was a different kind of exhaustion than before. It was the exhaustion that follows a dream taking its first breath. The inspectors pulled him aside before they left. Their voices held none of the sternness they had displayed earlier. Instead, they spoke gently, almost respectfully, acknowledging the purpose behind what he had built. They listed the structural adjustments they needed him to make. Nothing drastic, nothing that would undo what he had created, just enhancements to ensure safety. They offered guidance rather than warnings, support rather than challenge. It felt strange to hear them speak not as enforcers, but as collaborators. Daryl nodded through their instructions, committing every word to memory. Under different circumstances, their list might have overwhelmed him. But now, after what he had seen, after what the children had shown the neighborhood and the neighborhood had shown him, everything felt possible. Everything felt lighter. When the city truck finally pulled away, the neighbors remained on the sidewalks, less clustered than before, more dispersed, uncertainty softening their rigid postures. They didn't approach him immediately, perhaps unsure of how to start, unsure of how to undo what they had said or shouted or assumed over the past weeks. Shame clung to many of them, though they tried to hide it behind hands wiping brows or faux casual glances at the sky. But Daryl didn't expect apologies. He didn't need them. His focus was not on reparation, but on continuation. The playground needed finishing, refinement, stability. And now, whether the neighbors accepted it or not, it belonged to the children, not to him alone. He stepped back into his yard, removed one glove, and brushed his fingers across the memorial of laughter left in the air. The maze of painted tires, once a symbol of misunderstanding, now pulsed with something different, something warm, something alive. All the tension that had wrapped itself around his ribs for weeks loosened slowly, like a rope being unknotted one loop at a time. A soft creak from the fence startled him slightly. He turned to see a man standing by the gate, a neighbor he recognized but had never spoken to. The man's shoulders were hunched in a way that suggested apology even before he opened his mouth, though he didn't speak. He simply stood there, shifting from foot to foot, holding a can of paint in one hand and a brush in the other. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the man offered a small, hesitant nod toward the playground and raised the brush slightly, as though asking for permission. Daryl stared, not in anger, not in skepticism, but in quiet awe. There were no words exchanged, and none were needed. He returned the nod. The man stepped inside. They worked in near silence, painting a row of tires that formed a winding path toward the climbing structure. The neighbor chose a bright turquoise, a color Daryl had not considered but found surprisingly fitting. As they painted, others began to approach, not all at once, but gradually, like birds testing whether it was safe to land. A woman brought a pot of flowers and placed it near the entrance, stepping back to ensure it looked right. A teenager appeared with a handful of colorful chalk, drawing swirling patterns along the cement patches between the tires. A young father from down the street arrived with a wooden board he had sanded smooth, offering it for use as part of a platform. Even those who had shouted the loudest before now lingered quietly, some too ashamed to step forward but unable to turn away from what was unfolding. Children from the neighborhood, who had previously been forbidden to go near the yard, now trickled toward the gate with cautious excitement. Their parents stood behind them, watching, unwilling to deny what their children clearly felt drawn to. One little girl approached the painted tunnel and placed her hand on the top. When Daryl smiled at her, she giggled and darted inside, her laughter echoing faintly as she crawled through to the other side. As dusk approached, the yard no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like a village. People talked softly, shared suggestions, adjusted painted surfaces, carried supplies, and patched small imperfections. The once isolated man at the center of the storm found himself surrounded not by hostility, but by quiet cooperation. Even if some faces still carried remnants of skepticism or guilt, their hands were busy helping rather than hindering. It wasn't acceptance in its fullest form, not yet, but it was a beginning. Daryl stepped back to take in the scene. The paint, the flowers, the chalk, the wood, the newly placed decorations, the clusters of children weaving through the structures. It was everything he had dreamed and more. The playground was no longer just his creation. It was becoming theirs too. And that was the point. He had never meant to build this for himself. As the sky darkened into a deep navy blue and the first street lights hummed to life, a small figure ran toward him. A little boy with short hair and wide, earnest eyes looked up at him with breathless excitement. Without hesitation, the child threw his arms around Daryl's waist. It took him by surprise. For an instant, his breath caught, and everything inside him went still. "You made this?" the boy asked when he pulled back. His voice was filled with wonder, as though he were speaking to someone capable of magic. Daryl felt something shift inside him then, something that reached all the way back to the lonely boy he had once been, sitting in a junkyard stacking old tires into make-believe castles. That boy had needed someone like this. Someone to make a place where he could breathe, play, and exist without the heavy weight of the world pressing down on him. He had never found such a person. But this child had. "Thank you," the boy murmured and ran back toward the playground. The world around Daryl felt momentarily blurred, as though emotion had softened the edges of everything he saw. He inhaled slowly, letting the gratitude fill him like fresh air in his lungs. As the evening deepened, the neighbors began to drift away, one by one, offering small nods or lingering glances. Some approached him briefly, mumbling awkward words of appreciation or apologies wrapped in vague phrasing. Others said nothing at all, but their presence, their participation in the work, said enough. The hostility that had once stood like a wall between them had cracked, and through the cracks, understanding began to seep like light. By the time the last family left, the playground had taken on a new form. The flowers near the entrance looked perfectly placed. The turquoise path glowed beneath the dimming sky. Chalk drawings decorated the ground in pastel swirls. The wooden board the young father donated was now fixed securely into a climbing structure. The yard felt fuller, richer, alive in a way it had never been before. It felt like a promise. Daryl stood in the center of the yard, listening to the sounds of night settling over the neighborhood. Crickets sang softly. A dog barked in the distance. A faint hum of traffic drifted from the main road, but underneath it all, he could still hear the echoes of children's laughter, imprinted on the air like a melody that refused to fade. He sat down on one of the larger tires near the edge of the playground. His body ached in every place imaginable, but he felt something he had rarely experienced in his life, a sense of peace, a sense of belonging. For so long, he had carried this dream alone, nurturing it in the quiet corners of his mind. He had endured misunderstanding, isolation, hostility, and scrutiny. But now, as he sat beneath the glow of a flickering street lamp, he realized the dream had grown beyond him. He looked around at the structures he had built with his own hands and the ones the neighborhood had helped refine, all of them glowing faintly in the evening light. He imagined the children who would play here tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. Children who needed a place to feel free, to feel safe, to feel like dreams could grow from the simplest scraps of the world. He imagined them laughing, climbing, exploring, forming memories that would anchor them through storms of their own one day. This playground was not perfect. It would require maintenance, additions, improvements. It would evolve. It would change. But it existed. It breathed. It meant something. And in its existence, it carried the message he had longed for someone to give him when he was a boy. You matter. He exhaled softly, the corners of his lips lifting into a small but genuine smile. Above him, the night sky stretched wide, pulling away the last remnants of the day's turmoil. For the first time in years, he felt his heart settle into a steady, comforting rhythm. The neighborhood still had its flaws. Poverty still loomed. Struggles didn't vanish simply because a handful of people picked up paintbrushes or flowers or pieces of wood. But something important had shifted, something that would last if they let it. And as the night wrapped around him, as the quiet settled into the yard he had transformed, one truth rose above all else. In this small corner of the world, where people once saw only trash, now stood a place where dreams could grow. And they had. And they would. Tomorrow, more children would come. Tomorrow, laughter would return. Tomorrow, the playground and the community around it would begin again. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss our next amazing tales. Watch our other videos to uncover more secrets, mysteries, and incredible real-life stories that will leave you speechless. And make sure to share this video with your friends and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing your stories.